Hello, my name is Emmy DeGrappa. Each week, we bring you stories asking our guests the question why. We learn about passion, purpose, and the human experience. Brought to you by Wyoming Humanities with the generous support of the Wyoming Community Foundation. This is What's Your Why? Today, we are talking to Adam James Smith. He is an award-winning filmmaker. He is originally from England, but now based in the United States. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you. I love that you created a film called Americaville and that it is a replica of Jackson Hole. And what was your journey in creating that film? Why Jackson Hole and why Jackson Hole, China?
Great question, or great first question. So I've been learning about both Chinese and American cultures since I was very young. My dad was actually a businessman in China and the United States, and he would return home from his travels and talk about both places, his experiences in both countries around the kitchen table. And I think you internalize what your parents say, as a child. So as soon as I was old enough to start traveling by myself, and in Great Britain, that's around age 14. In the United States, I think it's much older. I traveled to China with a Chinese friend who was a little bit older, and I went to stay with him and his parents in a central Chinese city called Wuhan. And it was one of the most unusual experiences I've ever had in my life. Didn't see any foreign people for the whole 2 weeks I was there, only Chinese people. I got stared at all the time, and I'd never had an experience like it. I felt very displaced, very disorientated, and very, very foreign. I returned home and I developed an even deeper interest in China. At the same time, I was also developing an interest in the United States too, and much of our media in the UK, the television shows we watch, the movies that we watch at the cinema are produced in the United States. So we really have a lot of access and knowledge about American culture. So a bit later in life, kind of around the time I started college, I started to travel again to China and produce short projects there. I started to work with Chinese filmmakers, Chinese journalists, and at this time, China was kind of opening up to the world, and I was still very interested in this experience of being foreign in China, but more and more foreigners were entering the country and living and working there and producing projects there. And throughout my 20s, I lived in China, and I also came to the United States to study. So I kind of cultivated an interest in both countries and both cultures. I shot my first feature documentary in China after graduating from Stanford University in California, and I co-directed it with a Chinese filmmaker, and it was about the migration of rural people into a new city that the Chinese government had built called Ordus, and it made headlines around the world for being a ghost city, an empty city. A lot of people were confused about why it had been built, who it had been built for. And really in our film, we sought to answer this question. It had been built for rural people to house them while the Chinese government went about consolidating their farmland into large-scale industrial agriculture and moving them off the land into these new cities. So I finished that film. I went to China for a press week, and I had a press screening for the Foreign Correspondents Club of China. And I had dinner with a friend after that screening who was a journalist, and they told me about a cowboy town, quote unquote, that had been built 2 hours north of Beijing. And I was in Beijing, so I thought, wow, that sounds so strange. So I went back to my hotel, and I couldn't sleep that night because I was so jet lagged. So I Googled this place, or I think Google's banned in China, so I think maybe I typed it into Baidu, and up popped Jackson Hole Beijing. And I decided I have to go. I had one day off in China between all the screenings, and I rented a car, and I drove up there with a friend who later became one of the producers on the project. We managed to find it from this very vague address that we saw on the developer's website. It was very hard to find. It took about 3 or 4 hours to find. So it was quite secretive, and I'll explain why it was quite secretive in the early days, 5-6 years ago. We persuaded the security guards at the front entrance of the town to let us in, because Jackson Hole, China is a gated community. You can only access the town if you live there or work there. Anyway, they let us in for 30 minutes, and they followed us. One of them followed us around the community for 30 minutes. And amazingly, in those 30 minutes, we encountered Mr. Liu, the founder and figurehead of Jackson Hole, China, the man who built it. And he invited us to stay for 2 nights in the Grand Teton Hotel in the community. And we stayed. And during those 2 days, we interviewed probably 50 people. We went on several real estate tours where a real estate agent will take you around the town, show you various properties, and attempt to sell the Wyoming way of life, the American dream, however you want to call it, to potential Chinese buyers. So we observed all of this. After those 2 days, I thought there has to be a feature documentary film made about this place. It's so special. And I think because I had grown up and developed such a deep interest in Chinese and American cultures and societies, this was the perfect opportunity to explore the collision of American and Chinese cultures kind of colliding in this very unique location in China.
And what is the collision? What is the place where it comes together and weaves itself? I mean, I know just from our Chinese tourism in Jackson Hole that there is this great intrigue of the cowboy culture and the Western way of life. So tell me about that and where you found it came together for you.
Well, firstly, I'll say that Jackson Hole, Wyoming, the original, has become one of these places in China that is so famous for no particular reason. There are many alpine towns throughout the American West that are gorgeous places. Jackson Hole is particularly gorgeous and is situated very close to 2 amazing national parks, the Grand Teton National Park and Yellowstone. So that could be one reason. But for some reason, it's become very, very famous in China. And when you speak to many Chinese people who are looking to visit the United States, you'll ask them, where do you plan to visit? And they'll say, well, if we go to the American West, we want to go to Los Angeles, Las Vegas, and Jackson Hole. And you ask them, why do they want to go to Jackson Hole? And they say, well, it's so famous. It has all the right components. It's situated between mountains. There's a river that runs through it. It's very snowy in the winter. There's a very picturesque town, sort of a history of cowboy culture there. It's close to Yellowstone. So it has all the right factors that Chinese people are kind of looking for when they visit a quintessential American Wild West town, I suppose. So I'll say that first, that the original is very famous in China for those reasons. So to go into why exactly have they replicated it and built it 2 hours north of Beijing, this is quite a complex thing to answer. And I think firstly I'll say that many of the people who have chosen to buy homes in Jackson Hole, China, they grew up under very strict conditions under communism. They were assigned to work units. They had really no choice or very little choice over what work they do, over where they live, over what they eat, over how everyday life is managed. Everything was determined by government. So now that China has come out of that to some extent, and it's now more of a free market economy. Chinese people can travel, and they have all of these options, right? They can decide if they have money, if they have wealth, they can decide where they live, what they eat, what they do for work, and so on and so forth. It's a very powerful thing to exercise, the ability to choose to live in an American-style home, for example, compared to, a grey apartment building that they grew up in. In Jackson Hole, they see embodied not only tangible things that they want, like a large house and, to them, exotic furnishings. These items that you see around in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, like in my hotel where I'm staying right now, the lamps and the fabrics, and to them that's exotic. It's very fascinating.
Right.
So they have tangible things that they want there, that they're achieving. The American household items, the furnishings, the planting and the scenery, having a large yard where they can grow flowers and vegetables. There are also things that aren't tangible, that are represented and embodied within the place, that are a little bit more abstract, that they feel have been missing in their lives up until this point, coming out of this very strict period where most people lived in poverty. They see an expression of wealth, they see freedom, they see happiness, the idea of the pursuit of happiness, which is quite a new idea in China, which the Chinese have latched onto and have kind of rebranded in a way. There was a government campaign called the Chinese Dream. You should pursue the Chinese Dream, right? That the new Chinese administration kind of implemented their new propaganda campaign.
Doesn't that seem controversial, though, to being in China and what the government still wants to have control, but then they have this other side of it that is not the same thing? And so doesn't that go against their, idea and their idealism about what they want their country to be?
That's a very good point. And there is this tension in Chinese society right now, and in the specific location of Jackson Hole, China, right where I was shooting this documentary. When this place was built, it was really, my Chinese friend described it as a time of anything goes. So they started building the town around 2004, 2005, and have been building it since. That was a very different kind of political era in China, where developers could really build almost anything they wanted. But recently there's been a new nationalistic movement in China. There are new forms of nationalism kind of developing around the world, in Western Europe, in my country, Great Britain, in the United States, and indeed in China. China's not immune from it. And this new form of nationalism is seeking to reclaim some of the traditional Chinese culture and elements of Chinese culture that were actually destroyed in the Cultural Revolution.
Right.
The Cultural Revolution was a very stressful period of Chinese history because a lot of Chinese history was essentially erased. Many relics and buildings and temples were destroyed by the Red Army. And one thing that Mao wanted to do was kind of hit the reset button on the country and basically erase many of what he saw as things that were elitist, right? Destroy those things and then create a new culture. But ironically now, the Chinese Communist Party is trying to rehash some of these traditional Chinese elements from their history that were destroyed originally under communism. So there's this new form of nationalism in China that deems some foreign influences as unpatriotic. And Jackson Hole, China, and its inhabitants were even described in some articles by state media as traitors to China, that they had turned their backs on the Chinese national identity, whatever that means, and
I had read that,
and had favored American culture, and that really hit them hard. It actually rattled the leadership of the town, and this is covered somewhat in the film as well. this period when they're being criticized and how they respond to it, and how they go about trying to integrate more Chinese elements into this American-style town that they built based on Jackson Hole, Wyoming.
When was the first time that you came to Jackson Hole, Wyoming? You had already been to Jackson Hole, Beijing before you even came here, right?
Exactly. So I had been filming in Jackson Hole, China for 2.5 years at that point before I visited the original Jackson Hole. I actually visited in September 2017. So it's been a while, and this is my second time here to screen the finished film here at the Center for the Arts. So I had seen the replica first and then the original second, right? So it was a very unusual experience for me to come to the original Jackson Hole, and I was almost nostalgic for the replica because I lived in the replica. I rented a house there. I lived there on and off for really 2 years, and got to know the town very well, and the buildings and the names, the street names, and then to come to the original and see some of the same buildings, some of the same street names was kind of disorientating in a way.
And what did you think? Was it so close? Was it so different? The spirit here different from what the quality of life there. What did you find just was like not even close together?
Some things were close and some things were distant. I think the first thing I noticed when I arrived was, wow, there are also a lot of Chinese people in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. In September 2017, when I was here, perhaps even half the people I saw in the town square and over lunch in the restaurant that I ate in were Chinese tourists. So I sort of felt at home, almost back in Jackson Hole, China. So that was interesting. One of the main things that was different was Jackson Hole, China is a gated community. You have to live there or work there in order to access the town. And obviously here in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, anyone can access it. Although somebody pointed this out recently, that actually there are similarities in the demographics of the two Jackson Holes. So in Jackson Hole, China, it's really very wealthy people that inhabit the town, that purchase houses there, and that come in on a weekend or come in for a certain segment of the year, for holidays, for example, to spend time there. And while they're there, they really want access to wilderness and sometimes almost like a simulation of the rural lifestyle of being in the wilderness and being out there and hunting or fishing, or feeling that they're part of the natural landscape in a way, if that makes sense, or a rural life. And then, of course, there's this population of people who are maintaining the town, people who also live there, but they live in very different types of accommodation. They live in dormitories as opposed to these very lavish log cabin style homes, who are real estate agents and chefs and people maintaining the planting and mowing the lawns, doing the laundry. So really there are these two populations that inhabit Jackson Hole, China, and I've been told that it's quite similar here in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, that you have a very wealthy population who purchase lavish homes here, and then you have the service sector, people who work in the service sector, who are really maintaining the town and running it in a way.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, that is such an interesting, you just nailed it right there, is we have that income disparity here, and you have the service industry that is really working hard, sometimes 2 and 3 jobs to just live in Jackson Hole because they love living here. And then you have the second homeowner, the people who come in just, on a vacation, or they
Right.
They live here half the year and they fly in and out. And, you know, I think our airport is the only airport in a national park.
Really? Mm-hmm. It's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, so you have that. That's so intriguing. And I'm so looking forward to seeing the entire film because it brings up so many other interesting questions to me about, well, first of all, the Chinese tourism has been on the rise and grows every year, which is why when you were here in September. Yes. But it also just brings up the question of, is there this inner struggle for freedom in China? Or do they feel free?
Yeah.
How do they feel about themselves?
Yeah, it's a good question. So first I'll say, so because I'm not local to China, I'm not a Chinese person. I've spent an awful lot of time there, and I've really grown up with China. I do have a sense of how they feel on this topic. As I mentioned, older people in China, many of whom live in places like Jackson Hole, Beijing now, who are wealthier, who can afford a nice home in the suburbs of Chinese cities. They grew up under very, very strict conditions where they had very, very little freedom, if any. Mm-hmm. They were assigned to their work unit, and they had no choice over what work they pursued, over where they lived. Even though, very little choice in some cases of who they married, right? So now they've come out of that. And since the reforms and opening up of China, now they have many, many more options. There is this desire to really pursue their interests, I think, because they are more free to some extent in at least the material aspects of life, the choices that they have about where they live, what kind of home they live in, what kind of car they buy.
I think that's the human experience. I think every human being, wherever you live, wherever you're from, wants to have that outward expression.
Right.
And that freedom to pursue who you are and what you want and what makes you happy. So I feel like that's where your film really touches, on those kinds of things, which is very interesting. Well, I want you to tell me before we have to leave, where can people view your film? Can you download it someplace? Where can you find it?
So I just had the release week in California, and I screened it at the 2020 Santa Barbara International Film Festival in their documentary competition. And I had several other screenings. So because I just released the film, I'm going to be traveling around the country with it and screening at various venues, film festivals, organizations like the Jackson Hole Center for the Arts, museums, universities, and then at a later date, hopefully screen it on television and then on streaming services.
Oh, good.
So the thing that I'm really excited about with this film is engaging with audiences, being there with the audience. So I'm very attached to traveling with the film for the first at least 6 months. So I can go out there to meet audiences, talk about the complexities of the film, because the film, yes, it was shot in China, but in many ways it's about America, specifically about the American West, and the impact that an American media has had on the world. Because one of the reasons why this town exists in China is because Chinese people have seen representations of the American West in American movies, American TV shows, American advertising, and it's embedded in their psyche. They've seen these characters in fictional movies, and they've said, well, I want that. I don't have that, but I want that. And now that many of these people have the freedom to do so, if they can live in an American-style town on the outskirts of Beijing, they will do, right, if they have the ability to do that. But many of the desires are developed through seeing representations of American culture and the American West in this media that really permeates the whole world. It's not just
It's
the
not
United
just-
States,
Right.
right,
I
the
agree.
whole world.
Right.
Even I, as a kid growing up in rural England, I saw American TV shows and movies, and I thought, wow, it must be wonderful to live in America and pursue the American dream. And then I move here, and I realize, actually, it's not all like you see in American films. Actually, living in America can be very hard and is very hard. There are many challenges, unique challenges to pursuing the American dream here.
Yeah, that's true.
So I do want to engage with American audiences, talk about the film, what it means, why Chinese people, or this group of Chinese people, want to live some aspect of the American dream. And I'm tremendously excited about screening it tonight in Jackson Hole, Wyoming.
Thank you. Thank you. And it's been great talking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of What's Your Why? Brought to you by Wyoming Humanities with support from Wyoming Community Foundation and generous supporters like you. To learn more, go to thinkwhy.org, subscribe, and never miss a show.